for my last segment, I actually have some listener mail.
Here's the mail, it never fails. It makes me want to wag my tail. When it comes, I want to wail.
So I'm going to answer, it's not exactly a question, kind of a question, more of a comment. I'm going to give my thoughts about it. A listener wrote in, and let's do it. They wrote, quote, "I would love to hear you articulate how the Democratic-Republican Party absorbed all of its competition, the Whigs and the Federalists, and then morphed into two dominant parties, and then maybe elaborate on your own theories or opinions on that power move. I feel as if this was all orchestrated so the masses feel as if their freedom to feel as if there is the freedom of choice, but in reality you are choosing the same thing, kind of like Coke or Pepsi. It's just cola, right?" So, I'm not an expert on why some US political parties went away and why some stayed, like the historical reasons, but you don't have to know that stuff to figure out why our country's two-party system exists and how it's completely kind of screwed up. But let me go into it. Ultimately, our two-party system goes back to the founding of the structure of the United States government. One of the main reasons we have a two-party system is rooted in the idea that, it's rooted in the founding fathers having contempt for lower class and working class people. One of the other main reasons is the founding fathers had immense idealism, which made them think it would be possible to not have political parties at all. So this hatred of the poor that is often glossed over in American history mixed with their liberal idealism, and I mean liberal in the most traditional sense of the word. They were proto-capitalists in the burgeoning European tradition. So those two things together made George Washington not want to have political parties. And not just George Washington, a lot of the founding fathers. But the mechanisms they put in place to avoid political parties ended up creating the two-party system. When the United States was founded, George Washington and several others were very afraid of political parties. And the reason why is political parties were just beginning to develop in Europe. These political parties existed to represent the interests of groups and challenge the interests of other groups. George Washington didn't want a group of people challenging his American aristocratic interests. In the U.S., we're taught the early days of our country was like a bastion of democracy, but in reality, it was very elitist. George Washington and his peers had the power. They didn't want factions developing that may threaten that power, and political parties represented those factions. George Washington claimed all governments rightfully recognize that political parties are their enemies, and governments rightfully, it's in their right, repress parties because they want power. Washington acknowledged that political parties represent different interests vying for power, but he didn't want anyone else to have power. So on one hand, George Washington and other founding fathers were contemptuous of the working class. Washington opposed political parties because at that time a political party would be like, I believe this specific thing. If there's a group of people saying, I believe this thing that's opposite what they believe, there will be a conflict, and it threatened George Washington and his buddies. On the other hand, George Washington had ideological and idealistic motivation too, not just repressive motivations. George Washington and the Founding Fathers were, like I said, hardcore liberals in the old fashioned use of the term. They were pro capitalism or whatever. I mean, it was a little too early for capitalism to exist, but it was beginning to develop. It's like they knew it was coming, but at this point, so I'll just delve into this a little bit. So, really brief detour. So, in Europe, say when the French Revolution happened, they didn't actually realize that the revolution they were doing was paving the way for capitalism to exist. They didn't realize that their current feudal economic system would lead the way to capitalism. They were just looking to liberate themselves from their feudal lords. And then in the aftermath of the revolution, power was seized by arguably the next strongest class, or the strongest class that remained, the strongest and most organized class that remained after the revolution, which include the employer class, aka the capitalist class, aka bourgeois. So in that sense, liberalism existed before capitalism, even though, because liberalism is personified by like the American and French revolutions, or exemplified by the American and French revolutions. So at this point, liberalism hadn't quite bridged the gap into just being what I would normally call capitalism. Anyway, because of the new liberal worldview that was just starting to develop and come to power, Washington and other founding fathers were much more individualistically minded than the feudal continent they were leaving behind. And the reason I call their view idealistic, as in their view against political parties, is because the founding fathers were convinced that the best way for people to vote is if individual people ran for president and we individually vote for the best individual. The problem is the founding fathers instituted political system to make their individualistic political idea a reality. What they didn't realize is that a political system without parties is impossible, and the system that they designed worked perfectly for a two-party system. In other words, they purposely tried to make a system in which political parties don't exist, which led to our broken two-party system at kind of almost as a historical accident, right? And so in the US, we use a first past the post, winner take all voting system. This means that the first person to win enough votes in one round of voting wins everything. Also, you can only vote for one candidate. You can't do ranked choice. You can't be like, I want this candidate most and this candidate second most. On the surface level, you can see why this American system would appeal to individualistically minded people, but when you dig a little deeper, it becomes obvious that what our system actually does is make it impossible for anything except two parties to exist. It took decades, even centuries, for the U.S. to get this deeply cemented into the two-party system. Because at first, there were some fringe parties that pop up, become a major party, stay a major party, but only for like 4 or 5 elections and go away. Now it's just so cemented like concrete. These are the two parties and there's no budging. As for historical American parties like the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, I honestly don't know much about them, but I do know a little bit about the Whigs. And the Whigs were one of the two major parties from the 1830s to the 50s, and they were ostensibly the left-wing party, and the Democrats were the right-wing party. The Whigs, the reason why they eventually failed was because there was an increasing tensions between the two economic models in the United States: chattel slavery and bourgeoisie capitalism. The Whigs were ambivalent about slavery. They were more opposed to slavery than the Democrats were, but they didn't really want to talk about it or campaign on being anti-slavery. By the 1850s, slavery became the most important political issue in the country, and the Whigs had nothing to say about slavery. So one of the biggest, some might even say the only real factor, the biggest factors for why the Whigs decline is the economic tensions of the country became irreconcilable and the party refused to take a side. So I put a lot of ideas out there. Let me try to tie them together. I'm not exactly wrapping up. I have a little bit more to say, but I'm going to start tying the loose ends together. So the way that the U.S. political apparatuses are designed make them perfect for a duopoly of powers, a two-party power system, ruled by two. Traditionally, political parties are groups that represent a specific... I was going to say they're a group that represent a specific group. Political parties represent specific groups with specific invested interests. How's that? For example, a party representing agrarian landlords could act in coalition with a party representing industrial capitalists, and a party representing finance capitalists, etc. Those parties may represent the social elite, but they're still, in this system I'm imagining, different parties representing specific groups. That's traditionally how political parties worked. So in this sense, the U.S. doesn't even really have political parties. We don't have parties that represent specific interests. We have two parties with a very loose sense of a party platform, but they don't represent interests or specific interests. Instead, the Republican and Democratic Party should be thought of as state apparatuses themselves. The parties do not represent a specific group or interest. They're almost governmental. I would describe them as semi-governmental platforms that people run on to give themselves credibility. So it's not only like we just have two parties, we have two parties that are intrinsically linked to the government to the extent that the parties themselves are embedded into the government. I've used this example before, but think of the Communist Party in China. That's easy for Westerners to be like, oh, well, the party isn't technically the government, but everyone in the government is in the party, so for all practical purposes, it is a governmental body, even if it exists separate from the government per se. In the US, you can't really be like, oh, the Democrats and Republicans aren't part of the government. They are, even if the parties are separate entities. They do functions that governments do themselves. They don't do functions that conventional political parties do. So this is all big reasons why third parties don't get power. In order to gain legitimacy in the eyes of most voters, you have to go through the framework created and dominated by the two-party system. Most people have been conditioned to never vote for anyone unless they are a Democrat or a Republican. So now let me kind of start wrapping up. What should be done about this, you might be asking? If we wanted a politically diverse government in the United States, it would require dismantling a lot of mechanisms of the state apparatus. If you wanted a lot of political parties, a lot of things are going to have to change. And to be completely honest, I don't think those kinds of changes would come from reform. State apparatuses, especially in the United States, they're like so deeply integrated that it may require a total revolution for changes that give power to third parties to occur. It's just so deeply ingrained. So, unfortunately, I think there are three ways to advance a third party agenda. And they're not great options. I'm gonna be honest, they're not the most ideal options. The first is simply a full-blown revolution, which isn't going to happen soon. I'm sorry, it's just not. There isn't infrastructure for people to lead a revolution, and there's no group or party with popular legitimacy to potentially wage a revolution. And if there was a revolution, you could just redesign governmental apparatuses from the ground up. There, problem solved. The second option is more likely to happen, but it's not nearly as satisfying. This option is to build a movement outside of the two political parties and then use that popular movement to take over one of the parties. This happened with the Tea Party movement taking over the Republican Party in many ways. It also happened even earlier than that with the Republican Party when the neocons took over. It didn't used to be a neoconservative party, but if you're around my age, which is, I was born in 91, I was 10 when 9/11 happened. So it's almost unreal to me that the Republican Party wouldn't be dominated by neocons, but that did exist and they took over. And this was also attempted with the progressives and Bernie Sanders trying to take over the Democratic Party with their mass movement, but that sadly failed. So that's not exactly the same, but if you have a specific agenda, you could try to build a mass movement which then tries to take over a party, or at least integrate itself in the party enough to sway the general position of the party. The third and final option, which could be possible but doesn't happen often, is a new party could replace one of the current ones. I brought up the example of the Whigs earlier, because I think one of the parties would only be replaced if our country reached the level of tension as it was at in the 1850s. I don't think a party is going to go the way of the Whigs unless our country just starts radically changing and one of the parties isn't answering for the changes of the time. However, tension is increasing now. I mean, this is a tense-ass country, dude. And Democrats are still not choosing a new approach. They're doing the same thing that sucked when Bill Clinton did it in the 90s, and they haven't tried to do something different. They lost with Hillary Clinton, and they're still doing the same thing. How ridiculous is that? However, tension is increasing in this country, like I said, and I think it is possible that the Democrats get replaced. but it'll be a slow, drawn-out process with the Democrats slowly getting less relevant over time. In conclusion, I'm finally reaching my conclusion. I don't want to seem too cynical or disappoint any third-party supporters. But the simple truth is, third parties are not a viable route to win major elections in the United States. And the reasons that they're not viable go really deep into the DNA and the origins of the United States. I want people to think about how our parties and government systems and political mechanisms and so on, all of those disparate elements, I want people to think about how they exist as a system. The system supports itself and reifies the other elements of the system, and as much as it sucks, we have to familiarize ourselves with these structures to understand how they work.